All right, so today I'm going to talk about the truths and myths of preferential flow. So this is actually the third time I've been to this meeting. I seem to be an even year guy because I came in 2016, 2018, and now in 2020. And each time I've talked about preferential flow. And I didn't exactly know what to present different than what I had done before. So what I decided to do is tackle a lot of the things we talk about with preferential flow and put them in this context of whether they are a truth or is it a myth about preferential flow. So why do we care about preferential flow? Well, from an ag standpoint, we have fertilizer applications to the surface. We have soils that are built up in phosphorus. And we're concerned that when it rains, those nutrients are going to make it to the tile drain, eventually into Lake Erie, right? We all know that. We know that's the concern. And a lot of what we see about preferential flow is that we measure a high concentration coming out of a tile outlet. We have either a fertilizer application or some known soil test level on the surface, and we say the only way phosphorus can move from the surface to a tile, it has to be preferential flow, right? But there's not actually a lot of data on preferential flow regarding phosphorus transport, and that's we're going to talk a lot about water movement today, not necessarily phosphorus, but like we heard earlier in Brittany's presentation, water movement often leads to phosphorus transport. So last time I was here in 2018, I sat on a panel over in the chapel, and we talked about what are the difference between cracks and holes. And that's where we often go with the debate on preferential flow, is do we blame the cracks or do we blame the worms? And we get into these discussions. We say, well, cracks, we can see them. They're huge. They're visible. They're open during the summer. We get intense rainfall. Obviously, they're to blame. And then we look at the wormholes, and then we say, well, wormholes can probably usually go deeper than a crack does in the soil profile and connect to the tile drain. But wormholes have the different linings of the inside of the wormhole that may absorb or desorb nutrients depending on what your opinion is. So we go back and forth on this and say we're trying to place blame rather than just understand what's going on. And in my opinion, we honestly don't know enough about preferential flow that we can differentiate between a crack and a wormhole at that point. And that's my opinion, but that's what I generally believe. So today's objectives, I have three objectives. One, it's not on here, that's not to put you to sleep right after lunch. The second objective is we're not going to try to debate the difference between a crack and a wormhole. It's preferential flow is preferential flow in this presentation. We're not going to discuss nutrient transport because it just further complicates preferential flow when you add nutrients to it. So we're going to focus solely on water transport. And lastly, we're going to use a combination of lab studies, plot scale studies, and field scale studies to look at preferential flow. So a lot of what we do with preferential flow, it's really hard to measure at the field scale. So that's where lab studies come in. But then lab studies, we say, well, they're not reality, so we have to go back to the field. So it's back and forth, field lab, and that's how we get our results and try to understand these processes. So I've kind of oriented this presentation as a series of 4 true and false questions. So you don't have to answer them out loud. You're not graded or anything, obviously. But what I'm going to do is pose a suggestion like this. Preferential flow occurs in most soils. And then we're going to go through that as to why that is true or false. So that is the first question. Preferential flow, does it occur in most soils? So this is the most straightforward one I have. And this is just a quote from a paper from a guy who's been doing preferential flow research for way longer than I've been alive. And he said, the fact that preferential flow in soil is such a widespread phenomenon suggests that a continuous network of fast flow pathways exist in most soils, at least within the depth that's influenced by structure forming process. So that's wetting and drying, biological activity, and the plant rooting depth. And we can see this. So we've all seen these images of these dye tracer experiments where the whole soil profile isn't dyed. There are preferential flow pathways through the soil, whether it be wormholes or cracks. but water doesn't move uniformly through the soil profile. And when we specifically talk about tile drains, this is not meant to be something you necessarily need to read on the table, but it's just to show that there are a lot of documented cases where people have observed preferential flow to tile drains, and the locations vary widely. So just on this table, in the United States, we have Mississippi, Iowa, Indiana, and Ohio, studies done in all those states. We have Ontario and Quebec, England, Germany, and the Czech Republic. And all of these studies have shown at least some degree of preferential flow to tile drains. So, coming back to the question, does preferential flow occur in most soils? Yeah, it does. Even in pure sand, you still can have preferential flow just through finger flow. There are areas that, difference in wetting properties will generate preferential flow. So it does occur in most soils. It's going to occur, if you have a tile drain in your field, you have preferential flow. That's the big one. But vertically, most soils have preferential flow. So the second question I have, water transported to tile drains in cracks or wormholes is solely surface runoff. So we usually think about preferential flow as we get a heavy rainfall event, and then that runoff water is transported down a crack or a hole to the tile drain. So the way we studied this was actually a lab experiment. So we went to a field in northeastern Indiana, and we collected undisturbed lysimeters. And a lysimeter is essentially just a box of undisturbed soil. So we take a steel box, press it down into the ground, bring that chunk of soil back to the lab. And in this case, we used the boxes were a cubic foot in size, and the soils were a silt loam in the top 8 inches and silty clay loam in the 8 to 12 inch range. And the unique feature about the boxes that we made is that all around the inside, the side walls of the boxes, there was a 3/8 inch plastic spacer that lined the inside of those. The reason we included that spacer is because we wanted to create fake preferential flow pathways. So in this box, you think through a normal soil, you could have matrix flow, which just throws through the bulk soil, very tortuous flow pathways. You could have natural preferential flow pathways. That would be your wormholes and cracks. But by having this spacer, we're inducing a third kind of preferential flow pathway, and that's just simply flow down the edge of the box. We think about it, you could rain on it and just runs off right down the sides of the boxes. So not very natural, but it gives us a way to quantify something that's kind of like an extreme preferential flow, if you want to call it that. And then the bottom plate of that box, we mounted a perforated plate to the bottom of the box. And that allowed us to collect water specifically from that outside edge versus what was coming through the middle. So that was another way we could look at preferential flow, is that, we can measure what's coming around the outside, so we can separate that extreme preferential flow, or the one right down the edges, versus what was coming down through the middle of the soil. This doesn't mean that a wormhole or crack couldn't intersect that side of the box, and we couldn't have that happen, but it's just a way to try to test it. So what we did with this, we had 10 boxes total, and we saturated the boxes from the bottom, and we let them drain to field capacity. So the soil conditions were pretty wet when we did our rainfall simulation. So we applied a bromide tracer. So bromide is just they call it a conservative tracer because it moves like nitrate essentially does through the soil. So largely, we think of nitrate moving through the soil matrix. And we conducted a rainfall simulation. So we did a 1 hour rainfall, and we put 1.25 inches of rain on the boxes in that time period. And we collected samples at a really high intensity. Something we can't do in the field is we can collect samples every 5 minutes for a total of 24 hours after we rained on it. So I'm only going to show the results today from 2 of the boxes. And that's because these kind of represent all the boxes generally, and they are very contrasting. So here on the boxes, we have flow rate on the y-axis and time of the experiment on the x-axis. And you'll see there's two different color lines. The black solid line is the water that moved through the middle. And the dashed line is the water that came down the outsides. So remember that the gap around the outside of the boxes. So you can see these two boxes are different. So box 3, most of the water came down through the middle and less came through the edge, whereas box 9 was the exact opposite. Most of it came around the edge and very little through the middle. So when we put our tracer concentrations on there, this is our bromide tracers. Their symbols are for the two different, the bulk soil or the edge collector, and the patterns are the same, so I really didn't need to differentiate between them. What we see is that it took about 10 minutes, and we saw a huge spike in bromide concentrations. Going from essentially 0 bromide to 800 milligrams per liter of bromide and within 10 minutes of that, regardless of whether it was coming around the outside or whether it was coming through the inside of these boxes for both of them. So that kind of sets off when we see these kind of things where we see this like rapid flow, a lot of concentrations, really high concentration, that automatically triggers to most of us preferential flow. But we usually think of that as that, well, it hit the surface, connected with that tracer, then washed off down the sides, or it went through a wormhole. But that's actually not what happened. So this is a graph showing these are the bromide concentrations on the y-axis and the fraction of the sample that was rainfall. So if it's 0, that means none of the water in this particular sample was rainfall. If it was 1, the water was pure rainfall. So that means that would be like preferential flow. It didn't touch the soil at all. And what we found was that those 4 points right there at the top, that's the peak concentrations we observed within 10 minutes of the start of the rainfall, weren't rainfall. They were water that was in the soil. So it's essentially saying that that rapid transport of high bromide through 12 inches of soil or around the edges wasn't rainwater. It was actually water that was displaced from in the soil. So preferential flow doesn't have to be rainwater. Rainfall can displace water, and a wormhole, a crack, a tile drain, they drain freely moving water, and that water can be runoff, but it also could be groundwater, or it could be water from a saturated layer. So if you had a plow layer in your soil, and you got a saturated layer at 8 inches or something like that, and you get some saturation, that could also be preferential flow. So while preferential flow can be rainfall, it doesn't have to be. So the answer is false. So water transported to tile drains and cracks or holes is solely surface runoff, and that's false. The third question I have, and this is a big one because I know we talk about this a lot, especially related to preferential flow, is that tillage decreases the amount of preferential flow to tile drains. And why do we think that? Well, we run some implements across the field and it breaks up the wormholes, it breaks up the cracks. That's the idea, right? So for this, we're going to the field scale. This is one of Kevin King's edge of field sites in Ohio, just north of Columbus. Relatively small fields, silt loam, 1 meter depth tiles. Before we did this study, it was a long-term no-till, almost 30 years. And then when we did this study, the farmer tilled one field and the other one remained in no-till. So we essentially had a tilled field and a no-till field. And we collected some water samples from storm events before they tilled it, and then, so when they were both no-till essentially, and then 5 events after one was tilled and one was no-till. So this is looking at a similar thing to we did before. So this is just the number of storm events, 1 through 7, versus the amount of water in the tile drain that was rainwater. So the higher the bars, the more rainwater there was in the tile drain. So I split it between pre-tillage and post-tillage. So before there was anything happen to the field, both fields were pretty similar. There was no significant difference between them. They both had the same amount of preferential flow. They had the same amount of rainwater making it to the tile drain before tillage. But if we look at after tillage, it kind of looks the same. Those bars are the same height. So tillage didn't impact the amount of rainwater that was making it to the tile drains within a given storm event. So that was one field, one study, 7 events. So we expanded upon that a few years later, and we went to 4 field sites, and we had 3 plots in each field. And this experiment was revolved around fertilizer placement, but we're just going to talk about the water transport today. So before the experiment, 2 fields were long-term no-till, 2 were rotational tilled, just to give you some background about the fields. And we had 3 treatments. We had a broadcast treatment, so essentially we didn't touch the soil surface. We had an inject treatment, so we had slits that were 3 to 4 inches deep that were spaced 30 inches apart. And then we had a tilled treatment where we essentially mixed this top 3 or 4 inches of the soil. And then we put 1.5 inches of rain over 90 minutes on these plots, and we measured essentially how much rainfall was moving through the soil profile. So similar to the last study I showed you, there was no difference between these 3 tillage treatments. The amount of rainwater leaching through the profile was the same regardless of whether it was no-till or whether it was tilled. You may ask, well, why is that the case? Why don't we see an effect of tillage? I thought tillage broke up macropores. Well, when we think about the grand scheme of things, and that most of our profiles are 3 feet deep, if that's the depth of the tile drain, and most conservation tillage, I'm going to lump all that together, only mixes the soil 3 to 4 inches. So we're really only literally scratching the surface. So most of the flow pathways are staying intact. And also, there was a study done in Canada within the last year that they looked at some dye tracer experiments on clay soils, and they revealed that matrix flow is generally the dominant way water infiltrates into the soil, with preferential flow deeper in the soil profile. And we can see that in these pictures. You see that it's pretty uniform dye coverage on the top soil. So most of our infiltration in no-till soils, or even tilled soils, is matrix flow. So if we mix that matrix flow pathways up with more matrix flow, we don't change anything. And that's why there's no difference in the way water moves through the soil profile with tillage. That doesn't mean there's not an effect on phosphorus, but for water movement, it doesn't change how water moves. So, true or false, tillage decreases the amount of preferential flow paths to tile drains? That's false. Last one. True or false, preferential flow is always greater when conditions are dry. So this kind of leads us towards talking about cracks, because cracks form when it's dry, but we're not going to talk about just cracks. And this is by far the most complicated of the 4 questions I'm posing to discuss. So again, we went to the lab. We created artificial wormholes. This is a picture of inside a box. You can see our tile drain on the bottom. And this is a wormhole that we created with some mesh. So I say this is the wormhole for the worm who's preparing for doomsday, right? So is this real? No, it's not real. It doesn't even come close to reality, but it's a way to study it. And the reason we do that is because when we pack the soil, we know that it's only matrix flow through the soil, and we know that there's only one preferential flow pathway. So it really limits the amount of uncertainty we have in understanding these processes. And I should say our wormholes were 0.3 inches in diameter. We just chose that as our just because of the size of the dowel rods we could find to make our wormholes. So for our experimental procedure, we did 3 sequential 1-hour rainfall simulations. So essentially, we put 3/4 inch of rain on in 1 hour. We took a 15-minute break, did another one, took a 75-minute break, did a third one. So essentially, the wetness was increasing with each rainfall event. And again, we collected samples every 5 minutes during these events. So I'm presenting this a little bit differently than before. So here on the bottom, is our 3 rainfall events, and on the y-axis is our discharged precipitation ratio. So that's essentially saying how much of the rainfall was translated into flow out to the tile. So, for example, rainfall 1, approximately 20% of the rainfall we applied, we captured as tile flow, versus the 3rd rainfall event was about 90%, I think, of precipitation we added, we measured as tile flow. So essentially what we'd expect. The wetter the conditions, the more tile flow we get, right? The question is, well, how does preferential flow change as we increase wetness from one rainfall to the next? And there's 2 different ways to look at this, and I'll present them separately. 2 different perspectives. So here are the different color bars. It's the same magnitude. These bars are the same, just broken into 2 pieces now. The green bars are the fraction of that was rainfall. And the orange bars are water that would have been in the soil essentially before we did the rainfall simulations. So to look at this the first way, it's kind of like one of those pictures you can see 2 different things in. You look at it the first way, we say, well, the green bar is 94% here, and it's only 29% of the total there. So the amount of rainfall and tile flow decreases as we increase the wetness. So therefore, preferential flow is greater under drier conditions. But we can look at it a second way. And the second way is instead of comparing the green bar to the orange bar, we can compare the green bar to 1. So if we compare the whole length of that, so we see that the green bars really don't change a whole lot. They're pretty consistent across all 3 of those, right around 25%. They range from 23 to 30%. So that's saying the amount of rainfall discharged to how much rainfall we actually applied was the same. So regardless of how wet it was, we were still getting about 25% rainfall in tile flow. What changed was the amount of soil water, essentially, we were mobilizing. So this perspective 1 is like a dilution effect because we're just diluting the amount of rainfall with more water from the soil, whereas the second perspective is looking at it from a total amount. So we looked at this, going back to our soil box experiment that I talked about with the spacers around the edge. We looked at the same type of data for the same thing, and we found similar things. So again, here's that first rainfall simulation I already talked about, where it was at field capacity. We let those boxes dry for 28 days and rained on them again, and we see a similar thing. Under dry, the green bars don't change a lot, but their proportion to the overall bar does. And so we see this kind of weird response where we have both the similar thing, whether it was a repacked, really artificial wormhole, and we go to an undisturbed soil, but it's got these spacers around the edge. So we wanted to know, well, what does that look like in the field? So we use the field data. So here's, again, just a metric for antecedent wetness and our discharge precipitation ratio. So as it got wetter, we got more tile flow, just like we'd expect. And here is the values. Essentially, this would be that break point of those 2 bars for the field data. So unlike the lab studies where it would have been a flat line, we do see some increase in the amount of rainfall in tile flow as conditions got wetter in the field. But it's largely driven by rainfall intensity, not necessarily rainfall or antecedent wetness. So essentially, the amount of rainwater can vary by storm event due to difference in rainfall intensity, but the soil and groundwater contributions are what really increases when we get these big tile flow events. It's not necessarily the amount of rainfall that's being transported. Rainfall is just acting to mobilize water that's already there. So my hypothesis is that when we have a small flow event, let's say it's just a small event. It doesn't have not a one that the ditch comes up all the way to the banks or anything like that. But a small flow event can be antecedent controlled, meaning that think of a wet spring, small rainfall event, the soils are already saturated. We just get a little bit of rainfall. We could just see a little bit of rise in the groundwater table, and essentially there's no preferential flow of rainwater because it's just mobilizing water that's already there. But on the other hand, we could have the condition during the summer where it's dry, we get a heavy, intense thunderstorm, then preferential flow could theoretically be 100% of tile flow for these small events. Or it could be anything in between that. But when we start moving to these big events, so think about last spring when it was wet and we got rain every 2 days, and we were getting these big events, the amount of preferential flow is probably a lot more consistent during these big events because the flow pathways are similar. Essentially, that slope in the line doesn't change as fast for the preferential flow as it does for the amount of soil water that we're mobilizing. So small flow events could be 0% preferential flow. They could be 100% preferential flow. And that's where we'd see big variations in nutrient concentration. But the large events are probably fairly consistent. So preferential flow always occurs when field conditions are dry. I think that's false. I think if we look at it in terms of the total amount of rainfall that's discharged, we're still getting the same amount of rainfall that's bypassing the matrix, regardless of how wet the field conditions are. So to kind of summarize what we've learned today, so we have preferential flow occurs in most soils. Preferential flow isn't just surface runoff. These fast flow pathways can transport any freely draining water. That could be surface runoff, it could be soil water, it could be groundwater. Tillage typically doesn't decrease the amount of rapid transport and preferential flow pathways. I say typically here because if you're using a moldboard plow and you're mixing down to 8-12 inches or something like that, yeah, you're probably going to start to see an effect of tillage. But for most conservation tillage, you're not going to see an effect, and that's because most of the water movement in the top 3 to 4 inches is already matrix flow. And lastly, dry antecedent conditions don't always lead to more preferential flow, and that's because the increases in tile flow we see with bigger events isn't because there's more rainfall moving, it's because the rainfall is moving water that's already there. And I wanted to conclude with this last slide, why I didn't talk about phosphorus. Obviously, with most of these studies, we measured phosphorus, right? That's the reason we talk about this kind of stuff, is because we want to know how it transports nutrients. And the reason I did that is because most studies, so if you look across the literature as a whole, most studies that report a link between phosphorus and preferential flow are mostly just anecdotal observations. It's what I explained at the beginning. We have a high concentration in the tile. We have soil or fertilizer applied on the surface that is a risk of loss, and we just equate the two as the only way it can move from one to the other is preferential flow. And secondly, most studies, including my own, that look at preferential flow and phosphorus are always associated with fertilizer applications. That could be manure or commercial fertilizer. And so we don't really have a lot of data on just background phosphorus concentrations, not 2 days after a fertilizer application, because we know when we apply fertilizer and it's sitting on the surface and we have a heavy rainfall event, that's a risk of loss. That seems pretty obvious, but that's what we often study. So we don't have a lot of studies that talk about how water moves plus how phosphorus moves outside of that week or two round application. With that, I take time for any questions if we have any.
Any questions for Mark? There was a lot there. I really appreciate the work you've been doing. So when we talk about water movement and we get a rainfall event, and you talked about it really, I mean, is it in essence pushing the water down that's already in the soil towards the tile system when we talk about that movement? It doesn't.
So that water that's already in the soil can move into preferential flow pathways. And I think that's what we saw in that first box experiment I saw. It was that we got rainfall, and essentially it pushed water to the edges and then down. So as the soil wets up, and it creates a saturated area wherever it is, whether it's the surface or deeper, it can move into preferential flow pathways. So it doesn't have to be straight matrix piston flow down.
Okay.
It can move it sideways.